Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Dorigny. I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to Reed Hall and to our SNF Rendez-vous de l'Institut, our series where the fellows speak about their projects. The Institute brings together artists from around the world with Columbia faculty for a year-long fellowship. And George Lewis, Abigail R. Cohen Fellow at the Institute this year, is the quintessential fellow. He's an academic, a writer, a composer, a musician, a performer, an artist. He does it all. At Columbia, George is the Edwin H. Case Professor of American Music and Area Chair in Composition, where he teaches composition, history and criticism of contemporary music, and where he is a mentor to countless composers who've gone on to make a mark in the world of music, and several of them have been fellows at the Institute as well. The university owes it to him for turning its music department into the leading place for the study of computer music and interactive media. A trombonist, performer, and composer, George has written several books and has received too many awards to mention. Okay, so I'll mention a few. MacArthur Genius Award, the Guggenheim, and he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the one of Arts and Letters. Okay, and he's been a member of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music since? 1971. Bravo, 1971, when you were 19 years old. So, needless to say, the guy's been on the map for a while. A champion of experimentation and innovation. He's also the artistic director of the International Contemporary Ensemble, and we're extremely proud to have hosted right here at Reed Hall this past fall ICE's first Paris concert in the series, Performing While Black. Of all George's endeavors, perhaps his efforts to bring to light Black composers is one that's most dear to his heart, and the success of the concert he's organized is a testament to its importance. In his presentation, through the story of blind Tom Wiggins, George will bring together AI, race, freedom, and social responsibility, questions that more than ever keep us up at night these days. And no one approaches complex and disturbing questions with more grace and inspiration than George. So it's a real pleasure, dear George, to welcome you to the stage tonight.
Wow, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and also the Global Center and all the staff and people working so hard to get everyone to do amazing things. And thanks to all of you for coming. I can't believe it. It was great. So I'm going to, I might have to stand up, because I was hoping not to, but I'm a little lazy these days. But in any event, thank you. And I'm going to get started right on this, because it's going to take a while. If I can get through this in an hour, you'll be very happy. And so let's just start. Hopefully it should be okay.
However wide the world, I come again.
That was the opening of my 2023 speculative monodrama, Song of the Shank, and the theme is Reincarnation. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about this. The Czech writer Karel Čapek and his play, which a lot of people know about, R.U.R. or Rossum's Universal Robots from 1920. The play portrays conflict between human capitalists and a new source of labor, the robota, a term that has come down to us as robot. Čapek's model for the play was the robota system of Bohemian serfdom, which is about 400 years old at the and was similar to the later American sharecropping. Now, Čapek doesn't directly refer to U.S. chattel slavery, despite what some scholars have written about this. But his play does present parallels, the equivalent of house slaves, robots who do the cooking and the cleaning, and field slaves, robots who work the farms and the factories. But for both robots and slaves, there is denial of subjecthood, interiority, and the capacity for free expression. And so in other words, both robots and slaves are objects, pure and simple. And in Čapek's play and in the US chattel slavery regime, and perhaps afterwards, this objecthood was enforced by both law and custom. And this provides me with another opportunity to reconsider critical theorist Fred Moten's provocative observation that, quote, the history of blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist. And by object, Moten means the Black American, defined as such under slavery and its aftermath. Now, one of these resistant subject objects was the composer and pianist Thomas Blind Tom Wiggins, and that's the subject of the 2023 monodrama. Born under slavery in 1849, Wiggins performed at the White House at the age of 10 and became one of the most famous American composer-pianists of his time, probably the first Black American composer to achieve that status at a time when American art music itself was in its infancy.
Die Wiener Festwochen, die feiern derzeit ein Wunderkind, das allerdings schon in der zweiten Hälfte des 18. Jahrhunderts gelebt hat. Thomas Wiggins oder auch Blind Tom genannt. Er stammt aus einer versklavten Familie und hat dennoch mit 10 Jahren bereits im Weißen Haus Klavier gespielt.
Er hat vielleicht ein bisschen dasselbe wie Mozart gemacht, aber er war blind, versklavt und schwarz.
Thomas Wiggins, Blind Tom, komponierte bereits als 5-Jähriger und konnte auch komplexe Melodien nach nur einmaligem Hören auf dem Klavier nachspielen.
Blind Tom had a repertoire of about 5,000 works, including compositions by Beethoven, Bach, Chopin, Mendelssohn. I remember I gave this talk in the Czech Republic at the Ostrava Days, in which I loved talking about Karel Čapek in the Czech Republic. It was fantastic. And so a guy got up and said, well, you know, it's one of the works on there, it says that he played Beethoven's Pathetique Symphony, Sonata. I said, well, yeah, he did. He said, are you sure? I said, well, that's what the historical record says. Are you sure? Maybe it was kind of a simplified version. I said, well, maybe not, you know. Why would you think that? And he said, well, I've played it myself. And, you know, it's a very complex piece. And I said, well, you're not Blind Tom. But, you know, this showed me that whiteness is a really intense drug, and it's a worldwide problem. It's sort of an addiction, and like a lot of addictions, it kills you eventually. So the thing is about Blind Tom, going back to Blind Tom, he also performed his own compositions for piano, including his imitations of natural phenomena and machines, and we're about to hear his most famous piece, The Battle of Manassas, which he wrote at the age of 14 in 1863, uses notated piano clusters to evoke the sounds of bombs and battles more than 50 years before Henry Cowell and the Futurists. Now Jeremy played the stew out of that. I saw him play it at Tanglewood this past summer. He played along with Charles Ives, and he gave this long talk on decolonization of American music. I couldn't believe it. Jeremy Dank is telling Tanglewood about decolonization. I loved it. But, you know, if we're thinking about, there are these state of nature notions of Afro-diasporic people as objects are routinely found in Enlightenment era philosophy. And this is a quote from Hegel from 1822's Reason in History. It's typical of similar statements from Kant, Hume, and others. The Negro, as has already been said, represents natural man in all his wildness and unruliness. One must have to take ourselves away from, abstract from all reverence and morality, from what is called feeling, if one wants to understand him correctly. There's no echo of humanity to be found in this character. Now, in both Wiggins' life experiences and the reception of his music, similar debates about sentience in the Negro coalesce into a complex of paradoxes, and these paradoxes are triggered by Tom's undeniably subjective music making. Now, as one contemporaneous account put it, you can see it here, the boy is an ugly little N until he touches the piano, and then the sightless eyeballs seem to be searching the stars, and the great opera ear seems to be catching harmony from the celestial spheres. I never heard such power, such emphasis, such marvelous fingering sweetness from the touch of Thalberg, Hertz, de Meyer, Gottschalk, and yet it's the ugly little cornfield N of Georgia. Now, in R.U.R., similar debates take place over the sentience of the robots. Robots are not people. They are mechanically much better than we are. They have amazing ability to understand things, but they don't have a soul. And we've heard this about black people as well, not just in the United States either. So here, Fred Moten's important insight is most relevant, that subjectivity and sentience can be heard and can be expressed sonically. And if we're improvising musicians, we know this. We know that we can hear. It's like the early neuroscience researchers working on autism, thinking about theory of mind, and theory of mind could be expressed sonically. At one point, we sort of figured that out. In R.U.R., it turns out that the robots who could play music, are considered the most advanced, closest to being human. As a slave, blind Tom was a mere commodity, but as a musician, as Moten says, if the commodity could speak, it would be imbued with a certain spirit, not given from the outside. So thus, for both Moten and Čapek, sound becomes a basis for subjectivity itself. Okay, so I'm going to turn the page a little bit and get a little autobiographical. Since around 1979, I've been drawing from concepts from artificial intelligence, cybernetics, and socio-musical networks of free improvisation, and creating a kind of music making that includes machine subjectivities as central actors in a real-time co-created sociality. One could even call it a kind of creolization if you want to go that far. And if people don't like that, we can talk about it. These creative machines, as I've been calling them for about 25 years now, have been designed to stake out musical territory, assess and respond to conditions, and assert identities and positions, all aspects of improvised interaction, both within and beyond the domain of the arts. The most sophisticated of these programs, Voyager, was created in 1987. In Voyager, human and or non-human musicians, including copies of Voyager, can also play together. They are engaged in live improvised dialogue with a computer-driven interactive improviser that analyzes aspects of the other improviser's performances in real time, using that analysis to guide an automatic composition, or if you want, improvisation. The computers don't know the difference. In fact, who really does? Program that generates both complex responses to the musician's playing and independent behavior that arises from its own internal processes. So the system doesn't need prompts or outside input to generate music, and it doesn't have to wait for that to start playing. So in interactive performance with human players, the sonic behavior of the system results not from hierarchical control, but from a negotiation between the human and the machine improvisers. The result is a kind of meta-stability and quasi-predictability of behavior in the long run, while introducing variability in the short run. And this is experienced quite often in performance as personality, which gets us halfway maybe to the experience of subjectivity. So at this point, I want to present a series of what I'm calling subjectivity stories. That is to say, encounters with machine, personality, and subjectivity. And I will start with this one, music that plays itself. The idea of music that somehow plays itself or emerges from a non-biological intelligence is a common theme in folklore, science, and art, going back at least to this automatic flute player listed in the Musa Brothers' Book of Ingenious Devices from the 9th century, a common era in Baghdad. Over the centuries, this notion has been developed via various technological and discursive means. Now, I recall, this is one of my mentors, the late Malachi Favors, the bassist of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And I remember Malachi talking about a visit he had made to this African brother who had instruments that played themselves. The well-known 1975 book by African Music by Francis Bebe describes an incident wherein an accomplished musician, after trying an instrument briefly, hands it back to its owner with the remark that, "I have no way of communicating with someone who does not speak the same language that I do." And this extends the metaphor of musical performance on an instrument as representing or even enacting communication between two subject intelligences. The question of independent, intelligent machine agency is of long standing. To offer one example, in 1869, you can read this, I'm not quite sure what page of On Liberty this is in, but he says, supposing it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected, and prayers said, I really like that one, and prayers said, by machinery, by automatons in human form. And certainly musical machines were part of even earlier imaginings, notably Ada Lovelace's 1843 prediction of how the analytical engine she and Charles Babbage were attempting to build, which never really got built, but still the ideas were there, and that was a precursor to the first modern computer. And this machine, according to her, would allow the computation of elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity. And we see that today, of course. Lovelace was already thinking about artificial intelligence, but maintained that the analytical engine can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. 90 years later, computer pioneer Alan Turing's famous paper from 1950, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, challenged this assertion, which he called Lady Lovelace's objection, by suggesting that programming a machine to produce answers that we cannot predict would constitute a form of machine originality. So now we're getting to the League of Automatic Music Composers, which is where I came from, really. This is a League poster. In 1976, a group of musicians calling themselves the League of Automatic Music Composers developed interactive systems in a networked way using what were then called microcomputers in conjunction with, quote, homemade electronic interfaces. In contrast to the institutional base of most computer music efforts in America and in Europe, and it's interesting to see that the League of Automatic Music Composers started around the same time as IRCOM. These musicians, the late Rich Gold, Jim Horton, John Bischoff, simply used their own money to buy mail-order single-board computers for $250, and that's what they looked like. They taught themselves to program the computers in machine language, learned the intricacies of programming the output chips, and eventually connected their computers to both human instrumentalists and other computers in a networked conception that mirrored the community they had formed as a support network for their technological interventions. Now, each of the League's computers was running a program created by one of its composers that was able to produce music without outside intervention, an automatic improvisation program or an automatic composition program, as well as taking in data that could affect the behavior of its own system and outputting data that could affect the behavior of the other machines. Asserting a particular kind of political consciousness, the composers maintained that, quote, the non-hierarchical structure of the network encourages multiplicity of viewpoints. Now you'll notice when you look at that video, you notice that the people sitting at those computers, they don't seem to be doing very much. I mean, they're twiddling a knob here and there. It's because what these people would do, and this is the thing that really influenced me the most when I saw this in 1977, was that they just sat back and let the computers play. You know, they wanted to hear what the computers were doing. The computers were making the music. They didn't do anything. They just sat back and listened to it. And that's something that people who know me well know that's a big influence. As John Bischoff recalled, we spent a few hours setting up our network of Kims, and then we let the network play, with here and there for an hour or two. So, little computer people. There you go. You might like this one. The League founder, Rich Gold, joined the corporate world in 1985, producing Little Computer People, described in one article as the first fully autonomous computerized AI game. Around this time, I remember I ran into Rich on the street, probably in San Francisco, and he told me he was working on a little person that lives on your hard drive. And I said, well, what's it going to do there? He said, well, whatever it wants. Conception of the little computer person was clearly an outgrowth of the letting the network play social aesthetics of Bay Area microcomputer experimentalism. The screen presented a two-dimensional representation of a house, we'll see that in a moment, with dining room, living room, recreation area, kitchen, and other areas visible. The virtual person played the piano, exercised, watched television, and performed other quotidian tasks, and completely ignored the so-called user, who was often relegated to the status of voyeur. Hence the characterization autonomous, a representation of improvisation in everyday life. Eventually, the so-called users became aware that, quote, LCPs are basically quite independent, thus bringing into the picture a mode of machine agency that framed the little computer person not just as an object invested with agency, which keyed along Latourian lines, but as a quasi-subject. In the 1990s, Gold joined the team at Xerox PART that developed the concept of ubiquitous computing, or you sometimes call it the Internet of Things. You heard about that, the smart homes and all that. Alexa listens to you and sends everything to Bezos or whoever. In any event, computation and connectivity that is unremarkably embedded in the experience of everyday life, and is basically intimately connected with the idea of the network that came out of the letting the network play aspect of Bay Area experimentalism. It's very interesting that there's something now, we've been studying this a little bit at IRCOM with a team that I'm working with, Gerard Asiag and Marco Fiorini and others. And one of the things we're thinking about is we're trying to write a paper on ubiquitous music. And the ubiquitous music people, there's a lot of interesting talk, but they seem not to have forgotten poor Rich Gold, who was the only person among those three, Mark Weiser and the others, who had experience with network computer operation. And he did that through his homemade Bay Area Kims. So, and now we're going to have a short musical interlude. Here we go. Computer music for humans and non-humans. that takes us about, that was like 20 years in the blink of an eye. And, but now I'd like to turn back the clock a little bit to Rainbow Family from 1984, commissioned by IRCAM and created during my 3 years of residence here in Paris around that time. So I lived here for 3 years back in the 80s, and I met a lot of wonderful people, some of whom are in the audience tonight. So I'm going to play you a bit of what that looks like.
Next stop, 23rd Street.
Il y a l'attente et tout ce qui bouge, l'image, le son, les corps, l'attente d'une autre étape de la technologie. Il dit qu'on peut faire plus qu'attendre. Depuis 5 ans, il compose. L'IRCAM l'a invité pour mener à bien la création en première mondiale de Rainbow Family, œuvre exécutée par 4 ordinateurs et 4 musiciens. Georges passe ses nuits dans le studio avec sa Rainbow Family. 6 heures du matin à Paris, minuit à New York. Nuit et jour se confondent. Les premiers sons apparaissent.
I like that. Very nice.
Je veux éviter le concept de contrôle de l'ordinateur par les gens. Je peux faire contrôler l'ordinateur. Par exemple, quand tu joues quelques notes ou quelques phrases ou il fait quelque chose de prévu. Je voudrais que les ordinateurs peuvent bien comprendre un peu ce que les gens jouent. Et aussi, il faut que les gens comprennent ce que l'ordinateur joue. Les ordinateurs, si tu joues, il faut comprendre ça. Il faut une espèce de écouter. Il faut écouter. L'un l'autre écoute. So, c'est un ensemble écoutant, si tu veux.
So this is some of what it looked like.
You mean next time it won't do the same thing? It's just random. It's
Is this the beginning again?
So just put it on again. It's just like turning on a player. It just goes through its thing. It takes a little theme and works with it for a while. Then it goes through a new theme and works on that. And you can see it on the screen.
So when I say, it takes a theme and does these things with it, this is part of what it did and how it kind of did it. So you would call this a kind of transition network.
Yeah. What do you think?
I'm well.
Yeah.
I'm well. I listened to work. I don't know. What do you think? You?
I don't have anything to think. I'm just trying to figure out what you might need or want in the way the machine's playing. What do you think? Anything?
You can follow the machine. Try like a game.
It's like a game.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just interested in how you feel interactionally.
Well, I'm well.
It's cool.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So let me just point out a little bit something before I go on. Rainbow Family was the first of my you could call them virtual orchestra works. But it didn't start out as a virtual orchestra. You know, we had the human improvisers, you saw them, Joe Leandro, Steve Lacy, Douglas R.U.R, Derek Bailey. There were 3 networked Apple II computers which performed on 3 Yamaha DX7 synthesizers. You know, the audio input, you know, what the musicians played went to pitch following hardware, so the machines could see what pitches they were playing and how long they played them, and then they could see how loud, soft they were playing. And the input information was collected by one computer and sent to all the others. So sort of like a network of sorts. Now, but it wasn't conceived originally as a network of computers, but as 3 separate computer improvisers, each running a copy of the Rainbow Family software. So what I wanted was a band, like, you know, have 7 players. 3 of them are computers and 4 of them are humans. And the difference of the decision making, I thought, was among the 3 machines with the 4 people would be interpreted as a form of, you know, Simondon-like sonic individuation and subjectivation, leading to the creation of an improvising ensemble. So I was trying to construct a machine performative personality, or along the lines of what I identified in a 1996 article as an aphrological notion of an improviser's personal sound, where notions of personhood are transmitted via sounds, and sounds become signs for deeper levels of meaning beyond pitches and intervals. Now, that was a theory, but in rehearsals, no one heard that. Everyone started talking about the machine, not machine A, machine B, machine C. I tried all kinds of stuff, having separate outputs for each computer, or having a certain sound for each one. No one cared. I mean, so it was sort of like, basically because the machines were clones. They made the same types of decisions over the same time. It's not like if you have 3 tenor saxophone players and you've got, I don't know, the summit meeting of John Coltrane, Johnny Griffin, and Sonny Rollins, no one's going to mistake them for like 3 of the same people. They're not clones. They all have their own personalities. So if you want that kind of thing, you've got to build 3 computer personalities. I wasn't able to do that. I was just having a hard time creating one. And then the paradox of that is, once you create one personality, and then you feel like the others should have access to the same stuff too. So there's an automatically you're thinking that's never going to work. The only way for that to really work, in my vision, is to have someone else build another one that doesn't think like you. And so that's where you get the kind of individuation going on there. Now, in terms of, I'm going to show you this thing right here. Let's see how this.
A machine is an improviser who might not have the same seasoning that we do, but he's improvising anyway. So I deal with that.
Yeah.
So part of that is that I'm thinking about the sociologist of science, Andrew Pickering, and he calls this a kind of what he calls ontological theater, in which the artist has no definitive knowledge of how the work will behave, and instead sets in motion processes of unpredictable emergence. The implicit invitation is to adopt a non- or post-scientific worldview, which sees humanity as not in a position of cognitive control, but rather as simply caught up in the weather of unpredictable becoming. And in such a system, according to Pickering, the experiment lies in relinquishing, in part at least, the authorial control that is the mark of Western mastery. So this way of ceding control to the computer, this way of conceiving human and non-human relations seems congruent with what I wrote in the year 2000, a performance with creative machines of this kind as consisting of parallel streams of music generation emanating from both the computers and the humans, non-hierarchical, improvisational, subject-subject, or as Lucy Suchman wrote in 2007, humans are not the sole arbiters of agency in these entity-making processes. To be human or non-human is a doing or becoming, not an essence. So I'm about midway through this. Let's see. There we are. So a little bit of Faulkner there. So I regard the British artist Harold Cohen, I don't know if you've heard about him. I talked to a lot of AI music people who don't know about his work. His painting and drawing programs from 1972 is probably the most audacious programs of its era. And Aaron was not an acronym, but the name he gave to his program to emphasize its difference from himself and its independent artistic subjectivity. Now, early on, Cohen realized that his work was challenging long-standing notions of human subjectivity, while advancing a notion of phenomenologically experienced machine subjectivity. In a 1982 article, How to Make a Drawing, Cohen brings up several crucial conceptual points that later AI artists, including me, had to grapple with. First of all, he writes, much of what a viewer of a drawing needs from it is not, quote, what the artist had in mind, but simply evidence of another human being's intentional activity. It is the evidence of intention in the work that lends authority to the viewer's private meanings. Well, okay, but nonetheless, according to Cohen, Aaron had no intentions about representing such things. Aaron had less knowledge about the appearance of animals and landscapes than a 2-year-old child might have. However, to his surprise, Cohen found that not only that Aaron generated much richer, more diversified output than he himself had envisaged when he was creating the program, but there seemed to be aspects of the drawings that didn't seem to arise from the instructions at all. That's very spooky. You could think of that as a kind of machine animism. So Cohen was aware that in spite of Aaron's undeniable abilities, it was totally incapable of learning from experience, from the act of drawing itself. Each new drawing was made as if it were the first ever to be done. Now, that's a very interesting thing. We hear a lot of critiques of like so-called rule-based systems, but it seems to occur to me, and we can go into this in the Q&A if you want, that the current machine learning systems are also bound by rules and don't learn from experience either. So there's a kind of a big problem. And I'll tell you the sense of what I mean by learning from experience when we get into thinking more about what John Stuart Mill said about human nature. So, but in any event, he thought, well, how could an intelligence like this develop a personal voice? And yet, I would say that that's precisely what happened. Let me see there, that's what happened. That's the Whitney Museums. That was the show I went to, Harold's work. I knew Harold pretty well, and I knew the work, and it was fascinating. And there's a lot of similarities between what I do and what he does, with one exception that I will talk about later. He passed away in 2016. So.
I write programs, programs make drawings. Drawings are made completely by the computer. This isn't the case of computer-aided art making.
Harold Cohen has been an artist and computer scientist for over 20 years. I talked with him in his studio in San Diego on the University of California campus, where he has developed his own expert system to create original art. Is the computer being creative?
I think creativity is a relative term. Clearly the machine is being creative. The program is being creative to the degree that every time it does a drawing that nobody's ever seen before, right, including me.
Cohen found from the gallery goers' responses to what Aaron was doing that it was enough for Aaron to display intentionality or personality, or he liked to call it entitality, because it's not a person, as for it to exist as an artist in its own right. Now, Aaron Voyager, which was first realized in 1987, and its predecessors, including Rainbow Family and this work, Chamber Music for Humans and Non-Humans from 1979, embodied basically a form of generative AI. One difference between Cohen's programs and these music programs of mine is that Aaron did not interact with the outside world, while Voyager manifests both musical behavior and listening behavior, generating a real-time feature map of its environment that it uses to inform its music making. Both Voyager and Aaron present to human viewers and listeners not as a tool for projecting power, a recurring trope in AI today, which is being very, very strongly asserted, not as a source of power, but as a source of intentionality that can be interpreted and dialogued with via viewing, listening, and performing. Now,
I found the same types of challenges that I found playing in other duo piano settings. I had to listen, and I had to respond, and it was logical, the kinds of choices I was hearing, and familiar in a kind of way. It really does give you that, the feeling of being vulnerable. You know, I felt vulnerable in the moment, you know, from idea to idea, and I was really paying attention because I felt vulnerable.
Is that to say that you didn't feel like the machine was going to step in and hold you up if if you were coming to a low point on your side?
Well, I just think it, you know, I did feel that it was responding, and I didn't know how it was going to respond, but I knew it was going to.
So it was harder to predict than with a human associate, of course.
I don't know if I would say that.
Now, I interpret Jerry's demurral as a recognition that in her performance with Voyager, we often encounter not only with difference, but also intentionality and personality and totality, since, you know, for many, Alan's implication there's no value in essentializing machine difference as experienced in sound could be a truly unsettling prospect. I mean, but from her standpoint, improvising with the computer was really no different in kind from working with any other musical partner. I mean, I was looking on YouTube last night, and there was Jerry playing with Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette and Betty Carter. I said, well, you know, and she played with Wayne Shorter and Ornette Coleman. And she could say that she felt that she really couldn't say that she couldn't communicate with the computer. Now, that made me feel really good. But beyond that, as with all, this shows that in all these cases, as with experimental music more generally, the exploration of new forms of intelligibility is one of the goals. So Jerry Allen treated Voyager not as a tool, and that's the thing about Voyager, you can't do anything with it, you can't turn it, all you can do is turn it on and turn it off. If it wants to play with you, it will. If it doesn't, there's not a damn thing you can do about it. You know, you can't tell it what to do, you can suggest, you can negotiate, but you know, if you don't like it, tough, you know. I mean, it's just kind of like playing with anybody else. It's free being like you. And so the limit with a kind of subjectivity. And the limits of that subjectivity are only testable by interacting with it in performance and by listening, which is another mode of improvisation and interaction. And when she said at one point in another part of this essay, well, I don't know if I like that response. She identifies Voyager as one of those resistant subject objects. So we can hear this performance in tandem with Lucy Suchman's radical understanding that machine-human differences are discursively enacted and available for refiguring. And we can hear what Douglas Ewart said, the machine is an improviser who might not have the same seasoning, as proposing not an exploration of the metaphysics of machine consciousness, or whether machines can be truly creative, you know, but instead a phenomenology of freedom as dialogic interaction, in which a creative machine can be perceived by us as acting in a free way, and it suffices for the interaction that the device is free with respect to us, and that its action is not one that we can foresee or control, but perhaps one that we can perceive that we can influence through dialogue, just as if it were a free being like us. And it simply acts in a way that demands a response in return, or as Karen Barad, the theoretical physicist, might put it, agency becomes not an intrinsic attribute, but as a performative achievement. And this allows us to follow the philosopher Arnold I. Davidson when he writes, the ethical and political tasks and values of improvised electronic and computer music are not different in kind from those in improvisation between human performers. If machines are to participate in the ethos of improvisation, the poles of self-transformation and social intelligibility have to be central to our encounters from them. And of course, Arnold Davidson was one of the prime students of Stanley Cavell, who worked on intelligibility as one of his major themes in his work. So with that in mind, I'm almost at the end, but not quite. I can borrow a conceit of David Harvey's in conceiving of a fundamental condition of improvisation. And I set a very low bar, ascertaining what improvisation is. A lot of things, you'll notice there are 5 things here. Time and spontaneity aren't among them. And so think about this. And first, we're all agents. operating continuous and fundamental continuous condition of indeterminacy. We can't fully know what's going to happen next. So we have agency, we have indeterminacy. So not like the Cajun indeterminacy or indeterminacy versus improvisation, but indeterminacy as a subset of improvisation. And so we analyze our environment for clues as to where we are and to see judgments as to where we're headed. And that activity is also itself improvised. So we got 4 things. Okay, we got indeterminacy, agency, analysis, and judgment. And the last thing is we finally make a choice. And choice is a funny thing because it's outside the causal framework. That is to say, you can't really prove that I did this because, or I'm going to do this because. You can't do that. You can believe it, you can do what you want, but that's all the most you can do. So we make our choices. It's kind of like, I liken it to the collapse of the wave function. And Stefan Alexander said, well, that's pretty good for an amateur physicist. That's not bad. So, but we can't be certain of causality or correlation when we make choices. So we just make them. And so I started to insist, and I could go into this more if you like, but not for now. We don't have time. But I think I started to realize that I could actually talk about, I listen to Christian Wolff and these guys. They say, well, what we're doing is not really improvised. I say, well, why not? It sort of looks like improvisation. Aren't you guys doing this and that? And they would say something like, well, we have a special signature or something like that. I said, okay, well, I'm not hearing that. I'm pretty good at hearing stuff. So what is this signature? So, but it turns out that if you listen to something like, let's say, if you listen to something like you're playing, I don't know, crosshatch piece like December 1952. That's a famous piece by Earl Brown. And so you certainly have indeterminacy. It's, there's no notes or there's just a bunch of lines. You can turn them any way you like. But then you have agency to act, but do you have agency in terms of a Latourian way, a capacity to make a difference? Well, maybe you don't. What constitutes making a difference and how do you ascertain that? And analyzing the environment, well, why? I mean, they really didn't want you to do that. They didn't like psychology very much. And judgment, I didn't see the point. Choice you make. So that's 2 out of 5. So I said, well, yeah, you're right. It's not improvised, but not for the reasons you said. So I found a way a theoretical way that affected me. And the thing about this is that I wanted this definition of improvisation to be applicable to humans, machines, animals, and other entities. And so I wanted to free it from aesthetic and artistic models. So I wanted people to, the idea that somehow when we talk about improvisation, we go to music automatically because music is, and particularly the jazz, because jazz is one of those things that's, it's probably the most influential improvised music of the last century and going into this century. So at the same time, there's so much going on in improvisation in the rest of existence that I wanted to have a theory that wouldn't just be applicable to the arts. It had to be go further than that. And that's as far as I got with that. So we'll move on to the last maybe 10 minutes of this talk. Subjects, objects, and the world in between. Okay, the time is April 2004, the place, New York's famed Carnegie Hall, the big one, what they call Stern Hall now. The occasion, the world premiere of Virtual Concerto, a 17-minute piano concerto I composed for the American Composers Orchestra. The piano soloist was an improvising computer program, also composed by me, and you saw a version of that Jerry Allen played with. It was making its Carnegie Hall debut, maybe the first time the computer program made its Carnegie Hall debut as a performer. The orchestral score was pretty much fully notated, it looked like that, but the computer pianist was free to interpret what it heard in the music as part of its improvisation. Well, that was a very odd example of emergence because there's no sort of, subroutine that says follow these chord changes. But it seemed to do a pretty good job anyway. And I'm sitting there in the audience going like, how's it doing that? And I built the thing. So that's ontological theater in a nutshell. Now, one issue that came up in the preparation of the 2004 concert concerned how the computer performer will be credited. I suggested something like this: American Composers Orchestra, George Lewis Virtual Concerto, 2004 world premiere, Voyager improvising piano soloists. A lot of people didn't like that. The philosophical implication of crediting a piece of software as the main soloist on the same level as humans, that was actually obliquely addressed in the performance notes in the score. The score says, with the exception of a short passage at letter M, the solo piano part is entirely improvised, either by an interactive computer system or other computer-controllable piano or a human improviser. In either case, the solo improviser should maintain congruence with the specific sonic structures in the work while combining spontaneously generated musical material with transformations of orchestral sounds detected during the performance. So at this point, I felt pretty confident. They called me and they said, we want to do something involving improvisation in the orchestra. I said, really? Are you going to have the orchestra improvising? Well, no, we thought maybe you would do it. I said, oh, no, I don't want to do it. But I can think of someone or maybe something that could do it. But so the performance note in any event makes clear that Voyager, as the creative improvising performer, was capable of dialoguing with the orchestra, just as a human pianist might. But some people felt if we were going to credit the computer, don't we have to credit all the other non-human systems? And indeed, that point is congruent, again, with a Latourian understanding of agency. I think the term for that we've been using is flat ontology. Now that would not limit the crediting to software and electronic systems, but to all systems involved in production, including, in the case of the piece you're about to hear, the saxophone of Roscoe Mitchell. However, I used a word processing program to write this. It doesn't produce its own essays, although I guess you have ChatGPT now. The digital recorders, they don't decide what to record, how to mix, but Voyager takes an immediate creative role in the event as an improviser, as an independent way that is not really reducible to me as the programmer, and it doesn't even play like me. And so one critique of actor network theory, we're going as deep as we're going to go, this is as far as we're going to go into the academic mugu. One critique of actor network theory is that it's not developed a nuanced way of accounting for differential modalities of agency among human and non-human actants. Now, my view has been that any theory of agency needs to account for these different modes of agency, rather like division of labor. So we need to revise that to account for human-computer interaction at the intentional level, and that's because interaction with creative machines addresses questions of agency, subjectivity, and social intelligibility, creating a politically inflected, critically imbued aesthetic space. And that's what I count on when I make these pieces. It's not just trying to do cool things and make gadgets, but also I want people to think about what they're doing. And a space in which, as the sociologist Alfred Schutz noted in 1964, a study of the social relationships connected with the musical process may lead to some insights valid for many other forms of social intercourse. Because creative musical machine improvisers can participate in sonic world-making, manifesting self-organizing, interactive musical behavior that operates both independently and in dialogue with the viewer-auditors constructing gaze and activities, so performance with them are not simulations of actual musical experience, but just a form of making music together, as Alfred Schutz's famous essay had it. So this kind of music making bears implications far beyond the aesthetic, raising questions about how we now experience artificial intelligence in the world, but also challenging our understanding of the human. So we're going to have a couple more bits of clips of music. This is the reincarnation of Blind Tom. We get back finally to the reincarnation motif. In the reincarnation of Blind Tom, Thomas Wiggins is metaphorically reincarnated as a pianist. He's an AI. He's still black, he's still blind, but he's no longer enslaved. So that's what Voyager looks like today. why am I doing this? You gotta ask yourself that. Well, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise that computer artists would engage in explorations of what it means to be human by creating human-like musical machines, and that goes all the way back, as we said, to at least the 9th century in Baghdad. But also, this is a part of my ongoing exploration of what the decolonial might sound like. And those of you who've been here with me through the whole year, even while, and by the way, I wanted to mention that that piece you just saw was composed here at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, one of 4 pieces that I finished while I was here, and that was the biggest and the most challenging in some ways, including a lot of the computer programming. But this is part of my ongoing explanation of what the decolonial might sound like, presenting new ideas and new histories for classical music. Not to achieve diversity, but really for all you sort of music heads out there, you new music heads, what I'm looking for is a kind of new complexity that promises far greater creative depth. And I wanted, in my case, I wanted to know more about the fundamental practice of improvisation. And as Arnold Davison had it,
you know, I'll never forget that people were obsessed by how does it work? How does it work? And you gave an answer which you've probably forgotten it, but I haven't. The first question, and I've seen this happen again and again when we've done this, someone sees the computer playing the piano, and it sounds, put it this way, too good to be true. And someone always asks right at the beginning, how does it do it? How does it do it? As if that's going to solve all their problems. And you looked out into the audience when that person asked that question. You said, I don't know how I do it.
So dominant current methodologies for machine learning in music and other fields depend crucially on imitation, typically of a corpus of behaviors. Now, however, as I observed in an article published, well, let's see, 2000, quarter century ago, notions about the nature and function of music inevitably become embedded in musical software. Interactions with these systems reveal characteristics of the community of culture that produced them. And that's why face recognition programs think black people are criminals. So I return to John Stuart Mill's observation here that human nature is not a machine to be built after a model, but set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces that make it a living thing. But now, is that what the new machine learning programs are doing? Are algorithms that learn, quote unquote, to produce variations on a corpus ultimately reproducing the cultural values embedded in that corpus? And if so, how can we create new musical and cultural values from an existing corpus? You know, that whole thing, what was Audre Lorde taking the master's tools to disassemble the master's house? And what might those new cultural values end up becoming? Now, I'm asking really whether and how we can move beyond the corpus, beyond imitation. This is not just a technical question, but it's also a philosophical, social question. So I want to close by observing that this kind of music making, again, bears implications far beyond the aesthetic, not only raising questions regarding how we now experience artificial intelligence in the world, but also challenging our understanding of the human. So at the very least, doing that kind of challenge, that'll be something you'd want to get credit for in a concert program. If not today, then maybe real soon, because otherwise, in essentializing our machines, we risk essentializing ourselves. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you. It's time for comments and questions and complaints. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm just kind of wondering, because I know that like I know very little about computers, but what I do know is that the various languages, like new ones, are developed very frequently. And I'm kind of wondering, like, how have you thought about how new languages that are kind of developing can change the work that you did 40 years ago? Like, how can that, like, not the word improve, but how have this like new computer stuff has changed? I'm bad at formulating questions.
No, it's a great question. I mean, languages, you know. I mean, by what language, when I hear the word language, I think about, you know, programming languages. And there's so many different ones now. It's sort of amazing. And a lot of the ones that were used 40 years ago are still being used today. I heard, for example, that my son, as an astrophysicist, can get extra money if he became a Fortran programmer. Now, I confronted Fortran as a 7th grader, and I just couldn't make heads or tails of it, partly because of those damn punch cards. But, you know, so the thing is, that's language, but I think what I'm hearing from you is more like tools, and how can these new tools change what I do or sort of improve what I do. And in some sense, that's what I'm trying to explore now. And one of the things I've been a little chagrined by is how little effort the makers of these tools spend in making machines that listen. Whereas most of my work goes into getting the damn thing to listen, because it's no use to me as an improviser if it's not listening, just like, anything else. I mean, just like you're not listening to me, or men are from Mars, or women are from Venus, or whatever. I mean, these differences have to be overcome. And so that's what I think that I would like to work on, is it's not a technical issue. It's actually a social issue, and it's something that you could use the same languages to, but you change the culture.
I have 2 parts to my question. The first part is, I'm kind of thinking about Saidiya Hartman's idea of the fungibility of the black body, and when she works with, critical fabulation, speculative fabulation. You mentioned, you described the first piece of yours that you showed as a speculative monodrama.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And she was, I'm wondering about this term reincarnation, this invocation of the carnal, of the body, and if is the fungibility of the black body something that you felt that you had to deal with or not? So that's the first part of my question.
Can I start there?
Yeah.
I think that's definitely an aspect of it, but the thing is that fungibility goes way back. In other words, Blind Tom is basically a 19th century person. And what I've been noticing is that we've been putting on concerts here in France, such as the one we did of the Composing While Black. It was probably the first time in a very long time that there's been a portrait concert of the work of Afro-diasporic composers, maybe since the time of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Could have been that quite a long time. And I just sort of discovered that a lot of that work was being ignored. So that's a certain kind of the fungibility which results from absence. So that might be one way in which we would deal with that. Now, critical fabulation is certainly a topic of which I didn't talk about this piece, the reincarnation, the Song of the Shank. But the Song of the Shank deals with Blind Tom comes back from the dead, and he comes and talks to us, and he looks at what's around, and he basically sees that we're basically in the same condition we are now, and so that's very complicated. So in a way, that's what Jeffrey Renard Allen, the librettist, was doing. Now, what was the second part, Varun? What was the second part?
I didn't say it. I was thinking about when you quoted those really horrifying quotes by Hegel, and the other one about, calling Blind Tom an ugly N-word. All of us in the audience, rightfully so, gasped and scoffed. And I'm kind of wondering, this idea of colonial fascination with some other subject, do you think that there's a way in which that colonial fascination still exists even in this room, in this audience, or do you think that's been reinscribed somehow? Or do you think that the work of your music is doing the work of reinscribing that?
Reinscribing colonial fascination?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't possibly. Maybe you could say more about that.
I think that there's a way in which well, I'm thinking also a little bit about your viewership and your audience.
Oh, okay. You mean the people in this room?
Well, yeah, partially.
You're doing ad hominem against the people in the room. You're here too.
Yeah, I'm including myself in that.
Yeah, you got to include yourself in that. I mean, let me put it this way. I might go on to one other question. We can talk about this later. But it reminded me of, I was talking with someone about operas, and they were talking about how much operas cost and how the audience was very elite and all this kind of stuff, and what was writing an opera going to do about that. And I said, well, look, if operas were free, do you think they would have included black people because they were free? And of course not. No, the inclusion was not based on the economic model. It was based on what you just saw on the screen from Hegel, Hume, Kant, and all the others. Linnaeus, going way back as far as you can. So we're talking about a situation in which we do our best to confront those situations, and part of what goes on in terms of subjectivity is it's an allegorical moment. If we have to treat computers these days as quasi-subjects, we have to think about how we treat the people among us who really are humans.
That was a fascinating talk, and I thank you very much for that. And I feel very much out of my depth in even asking a question. But I'm curious. So I have a very layperson's interaction with AI, and I'm curious what your thoughts about, or if you've already moved beyond these thoughts, are regarding AI as you're using it, and sort of ethical considerations. Like, what concerns do you have regarding using AI, or have you moved completely beyond those concerns? And what were the concerns along the way?
Well, I'm not really a user of AI. I'm kind of, one thing, I make them and I interact with them, but my systems, you can't use them. There's nothing to be done with them. They're not like something you turn them on and you give a prompt and you get some doodad back from a server. You know, you can't use them to do anything. All you can do is interact with them. So you have to treat them like a free being. They're not tools for your use. So that's the first thing that we get caught up in, is the ethical idea, the ethics of using versus embodying. So that's one thing to think about, or real interactions that are authentic and not just, I use this to take power. And this is how AI is being sold, as things that you can use to take power with. And so, and you have to remember this now, AI has come back into the public consciousness. I just described you a trajectory that goes back to 1979, which is about 45 years. So of course it goes back about 15 years before that, when the first people started making AI for musical purposes. So, and then the other thing is, you have to think about this. Always when I look at, and I wrote this again in an old article, which is the AI systems that we are, you have to look at who's making the things and what their value systems are. And basically what you can do is you can basically glean the value systems from the way that things behave and what they find are important. And the large corporations that have made it so that, I mean, I got involved in this because I was interested in the AI people, you know, the old scrappers, you know, Marvin Minsky, you know, Roger Schenck, people like this. And they were thinking about, because I interact with some of those people, what it told you about being human and how you could explore the nature of humanity by doing these computer programs. And so you can use the computer as a tool for understanding more about yourself and about the world and about social spaces. So I don't hear a lot of that talk now about contemporary AI. There's not much of that. No one gives a shit about about being human now. You know, it's more like, I'm using this so I can, you know, get a Grammy, or I'm using this so that, you know, I don't know, Doge can come in and take over my job, or anything. I mean, so there is a huge ethical problem here, but I think it's one that you have to look at the people behind the computer and look at their motives.
While I was watching this, I felt it could be a metaphor for production of artificial and intelligent actions outside of the music space. And you were right. You were obviously so fascinated with agency and autonomy and all of that. So while I was watching this, I was watching it with great fear when the sounds or the power of the artificial intelligent output drowned out the musicians, ended their use, and just took over as a metaphor for what we're all worrying about.
That's interesting. You know, everyone hears music differently. I would say that, I mean, I look at it this way. When you look at the part of that video where they were talking about, people were talking about, well, you know, see, they said, well, it's just random, it's not going to do the same thing over again. People were trying to come to grips with what it meant to be in a world, the world we're in now, which we were not in 1984, in which we are dialoguing with computers at every moment of every day, and where we don't know even which which systems are human and which ones are not. It's all unremarkably embedded. So the time to be afraid of that, you can still be afraid of it. And maybe that was one thing that you could think about in terms of like what this kind of thing comes up with. But you know, I take a different attitude because I've been living with them for so long. I'm not afraid of them anymore. You know, and I also know that there's no way they're going to take over the world because they're much too dumb for that. And the people that program them are also pretty dumb. And the only thing is that the only problem with them is it's not the power of the computer which you should fear. It's their social and political and cultural power that you should really fear. If you're going to fear something, that's the stuff to fear. And if they're constantly trying to use AI to project that power onto the rest of us. But then the other thing is that we can also program computers that are resistant. So we can have a face recognition program that doesn't think that black people are criminals. You know, so the thing is now who's going to build that? You know, that's what it comes down to. So when Joy Buluwini said, well, if I put on a white mask, it recognized me better. Now, who built that system? That's what you want to look for. And if you want to have fear, fear that.
So I'm going to limit myself to the one question. I wanted to come back to the segment of the talk around improvisation.
Oh, okay.
To ask you whether or not you've gotten beyond the definition that you outlined here. As in, how was your thinking developed there? I'm really fascinated by the fifth point in that 5-step process about choice, given some of the questions that were asked just before, and how this capacity for choice making can have an impact socially, given that you're also thinking about how the machines that you build have and can be involved in social interactions. How's your thinking evolved around that improvisation question?
Well, we have to go back a bit for this. I published an article in 2007 in which there weren't 5 points, there were only 2. It was indeterminacy and agency. Then I kept adding them, and around about a year ago, I thought, well, 5 just about does it. But at the same time, certain things that didn't matter were things like time, where they get rid of the cliche that improvisation has to be spontaneous. For example, spontaneity is something that is often, you see it a lot in people talking about jazz improvisation, where it's kind of like, you know, the composers are the ants and the improvisers are the grasshoppers. And so to get past that kind of fable making, you start to see that, for example, the Great Migration of African Americans is basically a social improvisation that extends over 50 years and is also an experimental action. People didn't know what they were going to be getting into. They made judgments at every step of the way. They made choices. They were analyzing their conditions. Is this going to work if I go to this place? What's it going to be like? And they had agency. They had the possibility of choosing. So the choice factor is the one that they couldn't know what their choices were going to be like, but they had to make choices. And that's the condition I think we're all in. So that's as far as my thinking has gone to it. But if you could go further with it, I'd appreciate that, because right now it's, you know, and when I talk about improvisation, I'm really talking about the everyday condition of everyone. It's not a special thing for the arts, or it could, you know, for anything, anybody, you know. So, social, you know, just about anything you think of, including the act of music composition, or, you know, writing a book, or whatever you've got going. All these things come into play at every moment. So I don't know. Maybe that's as far as my thinking has gone, but it took me a long time to get here, so I'm still working on it. Yes?
Maybe one more.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I have a more rudimentary question, actually, going back to the, well, I mean, there's an intersectional aspect to this too, I suppose. But I found myself, now having seen and heard excerpts of and the completed work from Danauschingen a couple of times, and I found myself thinking about limits. And what I mean by that is the limits of whatever the system is that you're writing for. So when you're writing for a computer, it could do basically any sound at any time. When you're writing for the system that's playing on the piano, it can do any sound on the instrument faster than any human could ever do. And then a human improviser is limited to their whatever their body can do. And I'm just curious if that inspired you or, you know, gave you any kind of pause, or I'm just curious if that influenced your thinking or how you heard the piece in some way, and if that's motivated you to go in some other direction or the same direction.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, you know, I remember when the Yamaha disc clavier first came out, people started making all these Conlon Nancarrow pieces with these impossible things that real piano players could never do, and they made them on the piano. And some of them were pretty badly made because they didn't know how to, you know, you had to do a bit of work on these old pianos. You had to, I mean, in our case, we built this sort of, you know, 2-element array that would allow the thing to play soft and also fast. So the thing was, we didn't want it to play too fast because after a while, we weren't interested in making I am not a human sounds. You know, we wanted to make sounds that human beings could dialogue with, not just the people playing the music, but also the public. So, and there's a lot of gee whiz aspect about everything. And there's always, you know, a fast, it's like we wanted, the other side of it is that the limits are not testable except by interacting with it. In other words, when you make the program, you don't know what the limits are, even though you made it. There's the genotype and the phenotype. So when you send the thing out into the world, that's the phenotypic aspect where you find out what it can do by what it does. And then the thing is that someone could come along and find something. Someone plays with it and you think, God, I never heard that before, you know? You didn't go there. Interaction is what produces the difference and what produces our understanding of the limits. But a priori, I don't know what the limits are. So I don't think about limits. You know, if we're thinking around the line of, I mean, Foucault, you know, the limit attitude, what we're looking for is kind of an experimental attitude.
Thank you. This was fascinating. I don't think I understood much of it, but but my question, maybe this is naive, but I'm really struck by your emphasis on the interaction, right, between Voyager and the musicians. So I have two questions. One is, if you have a different group of musicians, do you get a completely different, you know, the musicians have their own subjectivity, right, and they're individuals. So not if you had 6 musicians, another 6 people might have a very different way of playing. And my other question is, what would happen if you had 2 Voyagers playing with humans?
Well, it's true. I mean, we did that, for example, we had 3 of them actually at EarCom in 2006, but I've heard that before. And to the last question first, see, when I told you that if they're clones, it doesn't work out very well, what happens is they develop a kind of codependency that you can hear. They kind of start playing in the same ways. They don't do radical changes. They kind of get stuck because each one knows too much about what the other one can do. They're both the same. But when you introduce difference, that is to say those 6 musicians you're talking about, then you get different performances. Like I did this as a kind of audience pedagogy. We used to do this. We'd have one musician come up, he would play, then the next musician come up and play, and then the system would respond in very different ways. It kept its own personality, but it still would do things very differently. So the answer to that is yes, and a lot of that comes down to how it can hear and what you have as the capability of hearing, how rich your sort of what they call a feature extraction set is, you know, what you're listening to, the different things you're listening to. And the more rich that set is, the more likely you are to be able to get individuation at the level of the interaction between the players. But I think that's something I don't think about much because it definitely plays a lot differently. If Roscoe Mitchell starts to play differently, it will hear that and do something different. And if someone else comes in, some completely different thing, like somebody, and you hear it a lot. That's why we heard Jerry Allen playing with it. We heard Joel Leandra playing with it. We heard Roscoe Mitchell. So all very different responses, you know. So that's one thing I think you can kind of count on. That's what it wouldn't be that interesting if it played the same way all the time with everybody, you know. So yeah.
Based on what you were just saying, you talked earlier about being a composer of the different machines that you've worked with, the different AIs that you've worked with. Yep. And you've presumably listened to and heard the AIs that are maybe made by other colleagues of yours or friends of yours that make music, but I don't know if there are that many.
Not many.
Okay.
I
then
mean, look, this is a very minoritarian field. It wasn't like you had lots of people making these things. It's not like today where you go on the internet and there's 6,000 ChatGPT clones. No. This is a very rarefied air. And to do what I do, I might still be one of the only people. So, but go ahead, please.
No worries. So then between the different ones that you have composed, do you hear common patterns of something that would be like your signature, things that interest you musically in the music that you make without AI, that then you hear recur in the different kinds of music they make?
Well, that gets into, in a way, the thing where people said, well, you're a player, so the AI doodad that you make probably plays like you. And so that gets into a problem because, as May just said, if it plays like me, how's it going to be able to respond when other people who aren't me are doing things? So it can't just be playing like me. It has to be able to be, and that also depends on how richly you think about the behaviors, what it can hear as behavior and what you're thinking about as behavior. So that's the first thing. And then what was the last part? Say that again. One last thing. It was about. Yeah. Well, there are definitely some recurring things. I mean, look. You listen to any composer, stuff recurs, right? I mean, I was listening. What was it? I was listening to Debussy. What was it? It wasn't R.U.R, but I heard something. And other people said, "Hey, that sounds like a part of R.U.R." And I said, well, and certainly composers, performers, artists have signatures. They have certain things they do, and so I don't think that you're making something. It's going to have its own signature, but it doesn't have to have a signature that has to have anything to do with what I do as a person that plays music. So that's like the argument from a different kind of base. It just I hear something that you played in this thing, George. I said, well, it's certainly possible, but I doubt it. Are we good? Thanks a lot.
I think you're really cool, George.